Welcome to another Eat the Fruit production. In this episode, we're diving into an ancient Phoenician text by Sanchuniathon known as the Generations of the Gods. This myth traces the genealogy and rise of the gods, detailing the early generations of humanity and their contributions to civilization. Through these stories, we see how the divine hierarchy formed, with certain individuals emerging as leaders and later deified as gods. Let's explore the roots of this narrative, beginning with the story of Sanchuniathon and the origin of these remarkable texts. Our journey begins with Sanchuniathon, an ancient scribe from Beirut, around 1400 BCE. His writings, preserved by later scholars like Philo and Eusebius, claim to draw on collections of secret writings from the shrines of the Amunes. These writings, said to be sacred lore from pillars in Phoenician temples, reveal a hidden truth. The gods were originally humans who became revered as divine figures after their deaths. According to Sanchuniathon, the Phoenicians had applied the names of their kings to elements of nature, worshipping them as gods who controlled the cosmos, the sun, moon, and stars. Eusebius, citing Sanchuniathon, used these accounts to challenge and discredit pagan religions, pointing out that their gods were merely mortal beings whose names were elevated over time. Sanchuniathon's work captures the divine genealogies and the mythic tales of gods and their struggles, preserved across generations and through multiple ancient sources. Narration begins. Early generations. Of the wind Colpius and his wife Bow, which is interpreted night, were begotten two mortal men, Aeon and Protagonus so called. And Aeon discovered food from trees. The immediate descendants of these were called Genus and Genea, and they dwelt in Phoenicia. And when there were great droughts, they stretched forth their hands to heaven towards the sun. For him they supposed to be God, the only Lord of heaven, calling him Baal Samin, which in the Phoenician dialect signifies Lord of Heaven, but among the Greeks is equivalent to Zeus Helios. Afterwards, by Genus, the son of Aeon, and Protagonus, were begotten mortal children, whose names were Phos, Per, and Phlox. These found out the method of producing fire by rubbing pieces of wood against each other, and taught men the use thereof. These begat sons of vast bulk and height, whose names were conferred upon the mountains which they occupied. Thus from them Cassius and Libanus and Antilibanus and Brathu received their names. Memrumus and Hypsiranius were the issue of these men by connection with their mothers. The women of those times, without shame, having intercourse with any men whom they might chance to meet. Hypsiranius inhabited Tyre, and he invented huts constructed of reeds and rushes and the papyrus. And he fell into enmity with his brother Usus, who was the inventor of clothing for the body, which he made of the skins of the wild beasts which he could catch. And when there were violent storms of rain and wind, the trees about Tyre, being rubbed against each other, took fire, and all the forest in the neighborhood was consumed. And Usus, having taken a tree and broken off its boughs, was the first who dared to venture on the sea, and he consecrated two pillars to fire and wind and worshipped them, and poured out upon them the blood of the wild beasts he took in hunting. And when these men were dead, those that remained consecrated to them rods, and worshipped the pillars, and held anniversary feasts in honor of them. In these early passages we trace the first 7 generations, from Colpius to Hypsiranius. Each generation added to the foundation of civilization. Aeon and Protagonus discover food from trees, while later descendants learn fire production and build the first shelters. Worship also takes root as they look to the sun, calling it Baal Samin, meaning Lord of Heaven. This progression from foraging to early innovations marks the beginnings of societal development. The generations advance toward a more organized society, with individuals rising in rank, forming the earliest leadership and laying the groundwork for what will become known as the gods. Narration resumes. Later generations, and in times long subsequent to these, were born of the race of Hypsiranius, Agrius, and Halius, the inventors of the arts of hunting and fishing, from whom huntsmen and fishermen derived their names. Of these were begotten 2 brothers who discovered iron and the forging thereof. One of these, called Chrysor, who is of the same generation as Hypsistos, exercised himself in words and charms and divinations, and he invented the hook and the bait and the fishing line and boats of a light construction. He was the first of all men that sailed. Wherefore he was worshipped after his death as a god, under the name of Diomicius. And it is said that his brothers invented the art of building walls with bricks. Afterwards of this race were born two youths, one of whom was called Technites, and the other was called Genus Autochthon. These discovered the method of mingling stubble with the loam of bricks, and of baking them in the sun. They were also the inventors of tiling. By these were begotten others, of whom one was named Agrus, the other Agruerus or Agrotis, of whom in Phoenicia there was a statue held in the highest veneration and a temple drawn by yokes of oxen. And at Byblos he is called, by way of eminence, the greatest of the gods. These added to the houses, courts and porticos and crypts, husbandmen, and such as hunt with dogs, derive their origin from these. They are called also Aletai and Titans. From these were descended Aminus and Magus, who taught men to construct villages and tend flocks. By these men were begotten Misor and Sedic, that is, well-freed and just, and they found out the use of salt. From Misor descended Tautus, who invented the writing of the first letters. Him the Egyptians called Thur, the Alexandrians Thoith, and the Greeks Hermes. But from Sadic descended the Dioscuri, or Cabiri, or Corybantes, or Samothraces. These, he says, first built a ship complete. From these descended others, who were the discoverers of medicinal herbs and of the cure of poisons and of charms. This passage introduces us to the next 7 generations, ending with Tautus or Thoth, culminating in 14 generations from the beginning. Here we witness the rise of the first named god within the genealogy, Chrysor. The tradition aligns Misor from the 13th generation with the Greco-Roman equivalent of Mizraim, the 13th biblical generation. This provides a strong link between the Phoenician account and the biblical table of nations. It suggests that the gods revered in these stories were once mortals whose influence elevated them to divine status. Narration begins, birth of the gods. From these descended others, who were the discoverers of medicinal herbs and of the cure of poisons and of charms. Contemporary with these was one Elion, called Hypsistos, or the Most High, and his wife named Beruth, and they dwelt about Byblos. By these was begotten Epigeius, or Autochthon, whom they afterwards called Uranus, heaven. So that from him that element which is over us by reason of its excellent beauty is named heaven. And he had a sister of the same parents, and she was called Ge, earth. And by reason of her beauty the earth was called by the same name. Hypsistos, the father of these, having been killed in a conflict with wild beasts, was consecrated, and his children offered libations and sacrifices unto him. But Uranus, succeeding to the kingdom of his father, contracted a marriage with his sister Ge, and had by her 4 sons Elus, who is called Cronus, and Betulus, and Dagon, which signifies Citon, breadcorn, and Atlas. But by other wives Uranus had much issue, at which Ge, being vexed and jealous of Uranus, reproached him so that they parted from each other. Nevertheless Uranus returned to her, again by force whenever he thought proper, and having laid with her, again departed. He attempted also to kill the children whom he had by her, but Ge often defended herself with the assistance of auxiliary powers. But when Cronus arrived at man's estate, acting by the advice and with the assistance of Hermes Trismegistus, who was his secretary, he opposed himself to his father, Uranus, that he might avenge the indignities which had been offered to his mother. And to Cronus were born children, Persephone and Athena, the former of whom died a virgin. But by the advice of Athena and Hermes, Cronus made a scimitar and a spear of iron. Then Hermes addressed the allies of Cronus with magic words and wrought in them a keen desire to make war against Uranus in behalf of Ge. And Cronus, having thus overcome Uranus in battle, drove him from his kingdom and succeeded him in the imperial power. In the battle was taken a well-beloved concubine of Uranus who was pregnant, and Cronus bestowed her in marriage upon Dagon, and whilst she was with him she was delivered of the child which she had conceived by Uranus, and called his name Demarus. After these events, Cronus surrounded his habitation with a wall and founded Byblos, the first city of Phoenicia. Afterwards, Cronus, having conceived a suspicion of his own brother Atlas by the advice of Hermes, threw him into a deep cavern in the earth and buried him. At this time, the descendants of the Dioscuri, having built some light and other more complete ships, put to sea, and being cast away over against Mount Cassius, there consecrated a temple. But the auxiliaries of Ilus, who is Cronus, were called Elohim, as it were, the allies of Cronus, being so called after Cronus. And Cronus, having a son called Sadidus, dispatched him with his own sword because he held him in suspicion, and with his own hand deprived his child of life. And in like manner he cut off the head of his own daughter, so that all the gods were astonished at the disposition of Cronus. But in process of time, whilst Uranus was still in banishment, he sent his daughter Astarte, being a virgin, with two other of her sisters, Rhea and Dione, to cut off Cronus by treachery. But Cronus took the damsels and married them, notwithstanding they were his own sisters. When Uranus understood this, he sent Imamene and Mora with other auxiliaries to make war against Cronus. But Cronus gained the affections of these also, and detained them with himself. Moreover, the god Uranus devised Betulia, contriving stones that moved as having life. And by Astarte, Cronus had 7 daughters called Titanides or Artemides. By Rhea also he had 7 sons, the youngest of whom was consecrated from his birth. Also by Dione he had daughters, and by Astarte again he had 2 other sons, Pothos and Eros. In this chapter we see the emergence of godly figures such as El Elyon, who correlates with the Most High found in biblical tradition. Here Cronus, also called Ilus or El, leads the Elohim, reflecting the biblical El and the Elohim. Later generations like Uranos, Cronus and Demarus engage in battles and rivalries, symbolizing the ongoing struggles within this early pantheon. It's from these tales that mythic figures and gods emerge, embodying the elements and powers they governed in a time when civilization and myth were deeply intertwined. Narration resumes cyclical order, and Dagon, after he had found out breadcorn and the plough, was called Zeus Aratreus. To Siddiq, who was called the Just, one of the Titanides bare Asclepius. And to Cronus there were born also in Perea 3 sons, Cronus bearing the same name with his father, and Zeus Belus and Apollo. Contemporary with these were Pontus and Typhon, and Nereus the father of Pontus. From Pontus descended Sidon, who by the excellence of her singing first invented the hymns of odes or praises, and Poseidon. But to Demarus was born Melicarthus, who is also called Heracles. Uranus then made war against Pontus, but afterwards relinquishing the attack he attached himself to Demarus. When Demarus invaded Pontus, Pontus put him to flight, and Demarus vowed a sacrifice for his escape. In the 32nd year of his power and reign, Ilus, who is Cronus, having laid an ambuscade for his father Uranus in a certain place situated in the middle of the earth, when he had got him into his hands, dismembered him over against the fountains and rivers. There Uranus was consecrated, and his spirit was separated, and the blood of his parts flowed into the fountains and the waters of the rivers. And the place, which was the scene of this transaction, is shown even to this day. Then our historian, after some other things, goes on thus. But Astarte, called the greatest, and Demarus named Zeus, and Adonis, who is entitled the king of gods, reigned over the country by the consent of Cronus. And Astarte put upon her head, as the mark of her sovereignty, a bull's head, and traveling about the habitable world, she found a star falling through the air, which she took up and consecrated in the holy island of Tyre. And the Phoenicians say that Astarte is the same as Aphrodite. Moreover, Cronus, visiting the different regions of habitable world, gave to his daughter Athena the kingdom of Attica. And when there happened a plague with a great mortality, Cronus offered up his only begotten son as a sacrifice to his father Uranus, and circumcised himself, and compelled his allies to do the same. And not long afterwards he consecrated after his death another of his sons called Muth, whom he had by Rhea. This Muth the Phoenicians esteem the same as Death and Pluto. After these things, Cronus gave the city of Byblos to the goddess Baltis, which is Dione, and Berytus to Poseidon, and to the Caberi, who were husbandmen and fishermen. And they consecrated the remains of Pontus at Berytus. But before these things, the god Tautus, having portrayed Uranus, represented also the countenances of the gods Cronus and Dagon, and the sacred characters of the elements. He contrived also for Cronus the ensign of his royal power, having 4 eyes in the parts before and in the parts behind, 2 of them closing as in sleep, and upon the shoulders 4 wings, 2 in the act of flying and 2 reposing as at rest. And the symbol was that Cronus, whilst he slept, was watching, and reposed whilst he was awake. And in like manner with respect to the wings, that he was flying whilst he rested, yet rested whilst he flew. But for the other gods there were 2 wings only to each upon his shoulders, to intimate that they flew under the control of Cronus. And there were also 2 wings upon the head, the one as a symbol of the intellectual part, the mind, and the other for the senses. And Cronus, visiting the country of the south, gave all Egypt to the god Tautus, that it might be his kingdom. These things, says he, the Cabiri, the 7 sons of Siddiq, and their 8th brother Asclepius, first of all set down in the records in obedience to the commands of the god Tautus. It was the custom among the ancients in times of great calamity, in order to prevent the ruin of all, for the rulers of the city or nation to sacrifice to the avenging deities the most beloved of their children as the price of redemption. They who were devoted this purpose were offered mystically. For Cronus, whom the Phoenicians call ill, and who after his death was deified and instated in the planet which bears his name, when king, had by a nymph of the country called Anobret an only son, who on that account is styled Eod, for so the Phoenicians still call an only son. And when great dangers from war beset the land, he adorned the altar and invested this son with the emblems of royalty and sacrificed him. In this final chapter, we see the continuation of power struggles and divine battles with the rise of Demerus, or Zeus Adados. The passage also describes how lands are divided among the gods, mirroring the biblical account in Deuteronomy where lands are allocated by the supreme god, El. As Cronus rises to power, the story reaches a climax with the eventual deification of these ancient rulers who live on in myths as both mortal kings and eternal gods. From history to allegorized myth. As we reach the end of this narrative, we see how Sanchuniathon's account reminds us that these myths were not always just stories. They were reflections of real events and people, transformed over time. According to Sanchuniathon, the once political events and influential figures of early civilization were gradually transformed through allegory, their original historical meanings obscured by symbolic interpretations that evolved into the mythology we recognize today. Quote from Sanchuniathon: "All these things the son of Thabion, the first hierophant of all among the Phoenicians, allegorized and mixed up with the occurrences and accidents of nature and the world, and delivered to the priests and prophets, the superintendents of the mysteries. And they, perceiving the rage for these allegories increase, delivered them to their successors and to foreigners, of whom one was Osiris, the inventor of the 3 letters, the brother of Chinar, who is called the first Phoenician." Through this passage, we're reminded that as these stories passed from one generation to the next, they transformed, taking on new meanings and interpretations that often obscured their historical roots. What were once stories of real events and people became the foundations of religious and cultural mythologies that endured for centuries. The Generations of the Gods text bridges the gap between the world of myth and history, revealing how our earliest ancestors understood life, nature, and the divine. It shows us how the lives and accomplishments of early leaders became immortalized as tales of gods and heroes woven into the fabric of ancient societies. This transformation from historical event to allegorical myth reflects the human need to understand our past and give meaning to the world around us. Thank you for joining us in exploring these ancient accounts. If you found this journey into the distant past fascinating, please like, share, and subscribe for more videos on mythology, history, and the stories that shaped our civilizations. Until next time, this has been another Eat the Fruit production. Take care and keep seeking knowledge.